The world of gospel music has always been defined by its soaring heights, its extraordinary ability to pull the human spirit from the depths of despair and carry it toward the light of hope. But on February 3, 2026, that light flickered and dimmed in a way that no one could have anticipated, least of all the man standing at the center of the storm. We often comfort ourselves with the belief that legends possess some sixth sense about their departure, that they see the finish line approaching from a distance and have the luxury of time to settle their affairs, whisper their final goodbyes, and exit the stage with a choreographed bow. But for Dr. Ron Kenoly, the man the world came to know as the worship general, the leader who taught an entire generation how to sing Ancient of Days, the end did not arrive with a warning. It came like a thief in the night, sudden and uninvited, a tragic interruption to a life that was still very much in motion, still reaching for the next song, the next tour, the next testimony that would set another soul on fire. To understand the weight of this loss, you first have to understand the man who stood as a titan in the global church for nearly 5 decades. Ron Kenoly was never just a singer. He was an architect of atmosphere, a builder of moments that transcended the ordinary and reached into the eternal. When he stepped onto a stage, whether it was a small church sanctuary with folding chairs or a massive open field before hundreds of thousands of worshippers in Lagos, Nigeria, he did not simply perform music. He commanded the very air to shift. The temperature in the room changed when Ron Kenoly opened his mouth. The skeptics became believers. The weary found strength. The broken discovered that their pieces could still make a beautiful sound. He was the bridge between the soulful rhythm and blues of the 1970s and the modern worship movement that exploded in the 1990s, a man who somehow combined the discipline and precision of a military commander with the tender heart of a poet to create songs that became the soundtrack of a billion lives scattered across every continent on Earth. But as the news of his passing began to ripple across social media on that terrible Tuesday, a heartbreaking realization began to sink in for those who loved him. This was not the peaceful transition that many had assumed it would be when the day finally came. This was not a gentle fading into glory after a long and satisfying rest. This was a sudden, violent shift in the narrative of a man who was fighting with everything he had until his very last breath. The shock was not just that he was gone, but how he was gone, and how quickly the world turned from hope to mourning without any time to prepare the heart for the blow. If you look back at the days leading up to that fateful Tuesday, you will find no evidence of a man preparing for a funeral. Quite the opposite. You will find a man preparing for a resurgence, a man who refused to let his body write the final chapter of his story. Despite the health battles that had haunted him in recent months, the struggles with pneumonia that had seen him in and out of hospital beds, the cardiovascular strain that comes with 81 years of high-octane living and relentless travel, Ron Kenoly was projecting strength to the very end. His social media posts in those final weeks were not the reflections of a man reviewing a life that was finished. They were the celebrations of a journey that was still unfolding, still climbing toward new peaks that only he could see on the horizon. Just 48 hours before the silence fell, he was thanking his global family for 48 years of ministry, counting the blessings out loud so the world could hear. He reflected on the 123 countries he had graced with his presence, the countless stages where he had stood with a microphone in his hand and a fire in his chest. There was momentum in those posts. There was energy. There was the unmistakable sense that while the body might be weary, the spirit was still looking forward, still planning, still believing that the best was yet to come. This is the cruelest dimension of a sudden death. It robs the world of the chance to say goodbye because the person leaving did not know they were going. There is no time for final words carefully chosen. There is no gathering of loved ones around a bedside to share memories and tears and prayers. There is only a brutal severance, a cord cut without warning, and the echo of a voice that was speaking of tomorrow even as yesterday slipped away. In the sterile corridors of the hospital where Ron Kenoly spent his final hours, there were no dramatic speeches about the end of the road. The conversations in that room were not about legacy or last wishes. They were about recovery. They were about getting back to the pulpit. They were about physical therapy schedules and medication adjustments and the next time he would stand before a crowd and hear them singing the words he had written for them decades ago. The medical turn, when it came, was so swift and so unforeseen that it left his family, his friends, and his millions of followers around the world in a state of absolute whiplash. One moment, the prayer chains were circulating with cautious optimism. The reports suggested he was stabilizing, that the worst had passed, that the prayers were working. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, everything changed. The monitors that had been showing progress began to tell a different story. The doctors who had been speaking of recovery switched to a different vocabulary, one filled with words that no family ever wants to hear. The world had been praying for his return, believing that he was out of danger, and then danger reached out and claimed him anyway. The irony cuts deep when you consider that a man who spent his entire ministry singing about the Ancient of Days, a God who exists outside of time, who sees the end from the beginning, was ultimately caught by the brutal finality of time itself. He sang of eternity, and yet he was as bound by mortality as the rest of us. We watched in the hours after his death as the tributes began to pour in from every corner of the earth. His cousin, the acclaimed actor Don Cheadle, shared his grief publicly, and the connection reminded the world that Ron Kenoly came from a family where excellence was not an aspiration but an expectation. Figures from the highest levels of entertainment and ministry alike began to speak, not in the measured tones of a planned tribute, but in the raw and unfiltered language of shock. This was not a memorial prepared in advance. This was an eruption of disbelief that a voice which had felt so permanent, so woven into the fabric of worship itself, had simply stopped. How does that happen? How does a voice that seemed eternal go silent without warning? How does a man who survived the rigors of the United States Air Force, who endured the cutthroat nature of the secular music industry during his early years performing under the name Ron Keith, who reinvented himself completely when he answered the call to gospel music, how does that kind of survivor succumb so suddenly when he seemed to have so much left to give? The questions have no satisfying answers, only the ache of their asking. In the weeks before his death, a fundraising page had been set up to help with his mounting medical bills, and that page tells its own story. Here was a man who had performed before presidents and kings, who had sold millions of albums, who had shaped the sound of modern worship in ways that will echo for generations, and yet he found himself in the humble position of needing his community to help carry him through a difficult season. The page was not built on the expectation of death. It was built on hope. It was a plea for a lifeline, a request for the kind of support that would give him the time and resources to fight his way back to health. And the response was overwhelming. People gave generously, not because Ron Kenoly asked, but because he had given so much to them over the years. The songs he sang had carried them through divorces and diagnoses, through funerals and failures, through the long nights when hope seemed impossible to find. They wanted to return the gift. They wanted to be for him what he had been for them. But while the world was reaching out to save him, extending hands across oceans through their donations and prayers, destiny was moving according to a different timeline. The generosity arrived, but the miracle did not, at least not the miracle they were praying for. The tragedy deepens when you consider all the unfinished business that remains in his wake. Somewhere in his home, there are notebooks with lyrics half-written, ideas captured in fragments that will never become full songs. There are voice recordings on his phone, melodies hummed during quiet moments of inspiration that will never be orchestrated into the anthems they were meant to become. There are dates on his calendar for meetings he will never attend, flights he will never board, churches he will never visit. This was not a man who had retired to a rocking chair to watch the sunset and reflect on a career completed. This was a general who died in his armor, his sword still in his hand, his eyes still fixed on the next battle he intended to win. The silence that followed his death was deafening precisely because it was so unexpected. In the gospel community, death is often spoken of as a going home, a joyful transition from the temporary to the eternal, from the struggles of this world to the peace of the next. But when death arrives with this kind of suddenness, when there is no time to prepare or process, it feels less like a homecoming and more like a robbery. We were robbed. That is how it feels. We were robbed of the final album that was still taking shape in his imagination. We were robbed of the final interview where he might have shared the wisdom of a man who had seen the world change dramatically over 8 decades and kept his faith through it all. We were robbed of the farewell tour, the chance to pack into arenas one last time and sing the songs together, to see him lift his hands and close his eyes and lead us into the presence of the God he had served since he first surrendered his secular ambitions for a sacred calling. We were robbed of the gradual goodbye, the chance to say thank you while he could still hear us. Instead, we are left with the abrupt silence of a conversation ended mid-sentence, a song cut off before the final chorus. As the details began to emerge from those who were present in the hospital during his final moments, the picture became even more harrowing. This was not a peaceful drifting into sleep, the kind of death we wish for those we love. It was a medical emergency that escalated in seconds, a sudden cascade of failing systems that left doctors scrambling and family members frozen in anguished prayer. The monitors screamed their warnings. The medical team worked with desperate urgency. The prayers rose with fierce intensity. And still, despite everything, the outcome was what no one wanted. It was the kind of end that Ron Kenoly, a man who valued order and excellence in everything he did, would never have scripted for himself. He was a man who understood the power of a grand production, who knew how to build a moment to its perfect climax, and yet his final exit was a quiet, sudden flickering out, a candle extinguished in a room far from the stage lights he loved. The contrast is what stings the most. We remember him under the bright lights of massive events, sweat pouring down his face as he led entire stadiums and singing until the walls seemed to vibrate with the sound. We remember the power of his presence, the way he could hold a crowd in the palm of his hand and take them wherever he wanted to go. We remember the joy that radiated from him, the infectious energy that made people believe that if this man could worship with this much abandon, then maybe God was real after all, maybe there was something worth singing about. And it is almost impossible to reconcile those memories with the reality of a sudden medical failure in a quiet hospital wing, the beeping of machines and the hushed voices of staff and the terrible moment when trying became pointless and all that remained was grief. But perhaps, when the initial shock fades and the tears have been cried, we will be able to see a deeper and more profound message in the suddenness of his departure. Perhaps the very tragedy of the end he never saw coming is itself a reminder of the message he preached for half a century. He told us that life is a vapor, here for a moment and then gone. He told us that the only things that last are what we do for others and what we do for God. He told us to worship with urgency, to love with intention, to hold nothing back because tomorrow is promised to no one. And then he demonstrated the truth of his own sermon by leaving us without warning, proving that even the mightiest among us are still subject to the fragility that defines human existence. He lived his life with an urgency that, in hindsight, feels prophetic. He traveled to those 123 countries because he seemed to understand, perhaps on a level he could not fully articulate, that the window of opportunity is never as wide as we think it is. He sang with every fiber of his being, leaving nothing in reserve, because he knew that every performance could be his last, every note could be the final one he would ever sing. He poured himself out completely, again and again, because he grasped a truth that most of us only understand intellectually but never truly live by. The time is short, and the work is urgent, and there is no sense in saving your best for a tomorrow that may never come. While Ron Kenoly may not have seen the specific moment of his death approaching on that Tuesday in February, he lived in such a way that he was always ready for it, even if he was never finished with his work. He died with more songs left to write and more nations left to visit, but he did not die with anything left to give. He gave it all, every single day, and that is the only preparation for death that truly matters. The legacy of Ron Kenoly will not be defined by the suddenness of his passing. It will be defined by the magnitude of the void he leaves behind, a void that measures the enormity of his presence while he was with us. When a titan falls, the earth shakes, and the tremors of his death are being felt in every corner of the